Excited to make a stop here at Logan as I've been on this Ally tour. So that's my tour bus, and you're probably, I think you're close to number 50 here of colleges and universities that I've visited since February. And that's from California to the UK, Norway, all the way down to Tasmania, Australia, Singapore. So I have seen how institutions are thinking about inclusive education, how they're thinking about accessibility really all over the world. And I can tell you it's pretty amazing. Everybody's kind of in the same boat. Everybody is starting to prioritize this more. They hear stuff like, you need to be captioned or you're going to get sued. There's kind of confusion about legislation, right? There's just all of this whirlwind. There's just so much momentum around universal design for learning. And so, but everybody's just getting started with it. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about universal design for learning in the context of Ally's alternative format. So that's really the student-facing side of Ally. You know, most of the time, especially as instructors, you're thinking about those little indicators and the accessibility piece, but there's a really great student-facing side to Ally, and thinking about some of the learning benefits there, how they support some UDL principles, I think is interesting. Then we'll dive into some of the instructor feedback, and that will really be an opportunity for us too to kind of talk and problem solve about different types of content that you may see and how do you approach it from an accessibility best practices perspective. So that will be a time for us to really talk, and then we'll do some reflection and some sharing. I wanted to start off with, you know, this kind of landscape of terms, right? Accessibility, universal design for learning, or UDL, inclusive design, right? What do they mean? And sometimes you see them in tension with each other. There was an EDUCAUSE article talked about the complex marriage of accessibility and UDL. You know, as we try to make our learning environments, especially online learning environments, you know, very interactive, very visually engaging. How do we also ensure that those environments remain accessible to everyone? And so, you know, starting off with that term accessibility, typically it's had a very disability focus, right? You think about access for people who use various kinds of assistive technologies, whether they're mobility related or vision related or hearing related. So having equitable access to physical spaces, and then of course digital spaces, right? Websites, our learning management system courses. And so typically we've supported those students with disabilities from this reactive position, right? A student declares that he or she has a disability, they work with the office, they, as you know, Christopher was talking about earlier, you get the content remediated if it's videos that need captions, or if it's PDFs that need to be tagged so that they work with a screen reader. This will always be a part of the process in higher education, right? Certain students will always require some specialized kinds of accommodations. There are also some real challenges with this model. First, you know, it can be hard at times to ensure that students have timely access to the materials, right? You as an instructor, you change something last minute, right? And that student is now scrambling to get an accessible version of the document made. So that can be, you know, leave students in a vulnerable position. It leaves them very dependent on other people, right? Every time you hand them a piece of content, they have to run over to the office to get it remediated in some way. So as a student, you know, having to rely on other people all the time. It's great to have that partnership. It's great to have that support, but also I think a sense of autonomy, a sense of independence so important. And then of course we know from the research, many students don't disclose that they have a disability, right? They come from K-12. They may have been receiving different kinds of services and supports in K-12 that they're, you know, for whatever reason they're no longer getting in higher education. There can be a lack of awareness, a lack of resources, right? The stigma sometimes associated with it. So many students who may benefit from access to accessible content that don't receive it. Now, when we think about barriers to access in the digital context, think about a document like this, right? That dreaded scanned PDF. We see, you know, about 10% of the PDFs inside of courses today are these scanned PDFs. There's still a lot of them around, right? It's obviously a document is totally inaccessible to someone who uses a screen reader, right? Because it's just an image. If I'm a student with dyslexia, this blotchy font is going to be really challenging for me to read, right? The off-centered lines and things like that. I was talking to one woman who works at College of DuPage, actually. She does a lot of student support. She says she has a student with anxiety. And when she opens a document like this, it's like a trigger for her because she's now suddenly overwhelmed by this horrible piece of content that's really difficult to read. So it affects a broad range of people with various kinds of disabilities. And then for any student, right, if I'm a student who wants to highlight the text, if I want to do copy and paste as I'm writing a paper, right, if I want to search for keywords, it's a very limiting piece of content. It's not a very usable piece of content. We did some research at Blackboard, so we looked at some of these accessibility barriers and, just to get a sense of some kind of key issues and how prevalent and these numbers really hold across most of the institutions that I visit. Upwards of 12% of those PDFs being scanned. Untagged PDFs is a big one, right? Almost 45% lacking the key navigation structure, the reading order for someone, how someone moves through that document. Documents with contrast issues. This one is classic kind of design problem, right? We've all been to a presentation at a conference. Professor did beautiful PowerPoint with pink font and a yellow background, right? Nobody can read it, right? So it creates challenges for students. Documents without headings. This is one that I was definitely guilty of when I was making my syllabi, right? Because most of us, we weren't trained how to use Word in a formal way. You kind of picked it up, you learned how to use it. You start your document with 16-point boldface at the top, right? And that's your starter, that's your heading, but it's not using the styles tool in Word, right? And when you use the styles tool, it's really great. I mean, when I wrote my dissertation, being able to automatically generate a table of contents, keeping my document more organized, one of those accessibility issues that's very prevalent, and it's just a matter of learning how to use the tools because ultimately it improves your authoring practice. And then images without a description. Obviously, somebody who is blind, who's using a screen reader, is going to rely on those image descriptions to understand what the content of an image is. But also, lots of students are leveraging text-to-speech technologies, right? Even students with vision sometimes prefer to listen to content. When we have those image descriptions, it enhances the ability for those tools to be used by our students. And the accessibility of content has actually been demonstrated in some studies to affect engagement in significant ways, even among non-disabled users. This is a study, it was a small study. They looked at non-disabled user engagement with more accessible websites and less accessible websites. And what they found on those more accessible websites is that people retained more information and they actually completed the task more quickly. So if you apply that finding to your course experience, if a student is struggling rotating pages of a PDF, if they have content that doesn't work on their mobile phone, ultimately it could affect how well they perform in that course. And so we want to start to think, kind of moving away too from this binary of abled and disabled and starting to think about the diverse needs of our students, right? So of course you have students with visible disabilities, students who use various kinds of assistive technologies to mediate their learning. Then you have students with invisible disabilities, right? Cognitive disabilities, processing challenges, emotional challenges. So how do we support those particular needs? As you were mentioning, many of the non-traditional students that are entering into higher education, students with families, students with jobs, aging students who are returning to the classroom for the first time in a long time. Of course, international and second language students, right? How do we support their particular kinds of learning needs? I always am amazed too, we think about disability as something that's very permanent, but people suffer temporary disabilities all the time, right? Your football player suffers a concussion and they can't interact, they can't read on the screen, or they break an arm and they can't interact with their keyboard. How do they stay on top of their work? How do they, manage their course demands? Students who are commuting, who are on the go, who are traveling abroad. And then the big one too, I think that mobile phone, right? We know more and more students rely on that mobile phone as part of their learning. When you think about low-income students who may not have access all the time to a desktop or a computer, how do we ensure that content works for them? And so what I like is this idea, and this is something that Christopher has talked about too, is really moving to this idea of proactive inclusion, right? Designing experiences that from the beginning can work across all of these different kinds of needs. Thinking about kind of personalizing or allowing students to have a personalized approach to the kind of content that they want to engage with. And so UDL, I think, provides a good framework for how to think about kind of this idea of servicing diverse needs, thinking about, right, the diversity of student experiences. And so they really operates from this mantra of providing multiple means of, right? So having options, having choices for how you engage with your course. And it's typically organized UDL across these three kind of key principles. So the first one is representation. So really here we're thinking about the course content, right? The PowerPoint files, the Word documents, the readings, the PDFs, the videos, all of the instructional materials that get uploaded into a course. So how do we think about providing students with multiple modes, multiple ways to engage with that content? Multiple modes of engagement. So this is really, what inspires that student to want to participate in the environment? How is it designed to engage their past experiences? What makes it relevant for them? How do they think about their own learning process within that course experience? And then multiple means of action and expression. So how do they demonstrate their understanding, right? Typically we think about this one as assessments, our classic assessments, multiple choice tests, or an essay or a paper, right? There's so many great digital tools out there, so many different ways that people make meaning in the world today. How can we maybe start to leverage some of those tools, give students some options, some choices in how they demonstrate their understanding? I'm going to focus today primarily on that first principle, although I will touch on the other ones, but this is the one I think that Ally really kind of gets at because Ally obviously works with the instructional content, with the course materials. The CAS consortium refers to this as the what of learning. It's the recognition networks in our brain, so how our brain is processing new kinds of information, new kinds of sensory outputs. And when we think about kind of multiple modes of representation, right, we might think about multi-sensory forms of representation, so presenting things in a visual format, presenting things in an auditory format, or more of a kinesthetic or interactive kind of format. Thinking about multimodal, right, the blending of different types of sensory modalities, sensory experiences in content. Well, increasingly students are accustomed, growing up in digital environments, to multimedia experiences. Thinking about those multiple devices, right? So as a student jumps from that laptop or desktop to the mobile phone to their tablet, right? How does that content work dynamically across those different devices? And then thinking about those multiple needs, right? If it's students that learn in different types of ways, if it's students who are traveling, who have particular kinds of context, particular kinds of demands on their life, how do we think about content that works for them? And I really like to think about this idea of learner preference when we think about representing opening up content in different ways. So learner preference, really this idea that students become conscious choosers about how they engage their content, what works best for them in a given learning context for a given learning objective, right? And I think it's important to make the distinction between learner preference and learning styles, because learning style has been around for a long time, right? The idea that somebody is an auditory learner, somebody is a visual learner. It's gotten some pushback of recent in some of the academic literature, some of the research that has, they claim that learning styles has lacked empirical evidence. I think it's a bit of a limiting idea of learning, that someone is only an auditory learner or someone is only a visual learner, as opposed to thinking about it kind of from this limiting perspective. Learner preference is just about choosing what works best for me in a given context, in a given learning objective. So sometimes an auditory approach may work really well for me. Maybe my English content, that works really well for me. Now I'm in a stats course. Am I really going to listen to my statistics chapter? Right? So thinking about what works best for that moment, for that objective. And I think when students do that, it really starts to foster this metacognitive awareness, right? If we think about that second principle around engagement, they're starting to think more about what works best for me. And I think that's so important in higher education, because we spend a lot of time teaching content. We don't teach students necessarily how to be effective learners. And I think many of our struggling students, it's sometimes less about the content and more about time management, goal setting, choosing, having good study practices, effective study habits. UDL refers to that as executive function, right? So that executive function is so important for struggling students, helping them become better lifelong learners, which I think is going to prepare them for a world that information changes rapidly. You're always having to develop new skills. Becoming a lifelong learner, I think, is so important. So developing an understanding of your learner preference is so, so important. Now, it creates a challenge for instructors, right? This sounds all great until you're teaching 60 or 70 students, and now you're asking, here's this guy up here telling me to personalize my content for 70 students, right? It's not a feasible thing, but Ally tries to help you by creating what's called alternative formats of your learning materials. So